Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next session of Virtually, a free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference brought to you by Nomensa. We hope you're enjoying the conference so far. Up next, we welcome back Chimmy Kalu of Triptease, who you may have seen speak at Interact Virtual Festival last year. Chimmy's talk, Practical Accessibility, Tips for Designers and Developers to Start Shipping More Accessible Products Immediately. In this talk, Chimmy will provide a list of things you can start doing immediately to improve the accessibility of your products. As always, please say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there's any issues with the stream as we go along, and we'll try and get that sorted. Please also do ask lots of questions using the Q&A function, and I'll get through as many as these as I can with Chimmy at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Chimmy to kick things off.
Hi, hello, I'm Chimmy and I'm a product designer. So I've been working with a range of companies, and I guess I was fortunate at the very start of my career to be aware of accessibility as part of a baseline of my design process. Today's talk is for people that already know that they want to create accessible products. I'm not going to be trying to convince anyone to make their stuff accessible. It's also not an introduction to accessibility, so I've assumed that you're fairly familiar with what the concept is and are interested in the how as opposed to the what and the why. What are we going to cover today? I design for people. So I try to ask people I design for or with who their ideal customer is. And I'm focusing the talk around people's needs. So we'll look at the tips around people who have impairments or disabilities related to vision, hearing, movement, and cognition. Vision is our kickoff point and is fairly interesting. According to the World Health Organization, in February this year, there are 2.2 billion people in the world with some sort of near or distance vision impairment. Typically, when we talk about disabilities in vision or with vision, people tend to think about sort of blindness, cataracts, and other sort of permanent disabilities in that way. And I wanted to just sort of highlight that I wear glasses. If I took off my glasses, I would be fairly useless with distance vision. Yet people don't always think about me as disabled. I'm not trying to co-opt it. I'm just saying my needs, my accessibility needs have been met so completely that people don't think about having no glasses as any kind of impediment. However, this is something that you need to pay attention to, because if I don't have my glasses, then I have different needs when I'm using a computer. Things to consider around these areas. When we're thinking about vision and accessibility, we want to dive into navigation, so how people go through a digital product, like a website or an app. We want to look at how you treat text and typography, what to do with contrast, forms, the use of images, color, and language. To start, let's talk about navigation. When I say navigation, people tend to think about sort of only global navigation, but navigation is all of the functionality that lets people get from page to page or screen to screen within your digital product. Global navigation usually has a place of importance, so people are tempted to put everything into their global navigation. I've seen global navigation that represents sort of all of the departments within an organization, or all of the things that anyone within the organization thinks about. Global navigation at the top of the screen is usually the first thing that people with assistive technology have to encounter. And if you make your global navigation large, then there's a lot of content that they have to get through before they can even get to the main area of the screen. So what I'd like you to do instead is include only the most relevant and important links within your global navigation. Ideally, you want 5 to 8 top elements. If you must have more than that, then you absolutely have to have a skip to content link. This means that if someone gets to your page and there's a ton of navigation elements in the top, that they can just go straight to the meat of the page using that skip to content link. The other thing to pay attention to is headings. So if you wrote HTML, by default, it comes with structured content, formatted headings. Designers have a tendency to change this and not keep the structure of the page. Formatted headings are so important to letting people with assistive technology and even people that can see scan your content successfully. So from a code perspective, if your headings are formatted, then someone can go from an H1, there should only be one on the page, to your H2s. If they click into the H2s, they go onto the H3s, and so on and so forth. Very important stuff. From a visual perspective, because not everyone who has accessibility needs here is blind, you want to make sure that you use larger font sizes, heavier font weights to make your headings visually distinct from your paragraph text. In the image on my screen, there's a page from the government, gov.uk, which has to be highly accessible. You can see that the page is structured quite well. There's a H1, smoking at work, the law, and then there's some other headings beneath that. So penalty for smoking in the workplace, what businesses must do. And you can kind of scan those headings very easily because of the treatment from a visual perspective, making it very distinct from the body text. But you can also, if you went and inspected the code, you would find that those headings are equally formatted in code so that someone using a screen reader can go through much like I've just done with my eyes. Links have to be underlined. They have to stand out from the rest of the text on the page with something other than color. There's lots of temptation for people to just go, oh, well, yes, the color is different. But if I couldn't see color, then how would I know what was a link and what wasn't, given that the headings might be the same weight as the body text? What you want to do is use those underlines, and that will mean that people can sort of scan the page and see what's the link. When people are scanning, they probably aren't reading the surrounding text. So links have to say what they mean. They have to give an indication of what the person who clicks the link is going to expect. For example, in the WISE screen that I have, the screenshot, we can see that there's a link that says, read more about business transfers, we'll never share it, pay from your bank account. Without any context, without telling you what any of those things are, you have a sense of what they're doing. Please do not ever use click here, click there, click this document, because those things mean nothing to someone that's traversing the page with assistive technology. I should have probably pointed out that as we go through each of these pages, I've just called out a little bit people that I think should pay attention to some of these elements. So the previous screen, I had sort of designers and writers and developers. And on this one, I'm calling out that this is important to people that are designing pages and writing content. Next, we'll talk about text and typography. Now, for someone who has quite poor distance vision, I actually have quite excellent near vision. So I've adjusted my iPhone to have the smallest text that you can have on a screen. However, this doesn't mean that I don't pay attention to other needs that other kinds of users might have. If we're designing for an Android or an iOS device, it's very easy to create stuff that's accessible by default because Android, so Google and Apple, have done quite a bit of work to make sure that the operating systems are very accessible. So if you design using scale or density independent pixels, your text will scale appropriately regardless of the settings that the user chooses on their phone. there's an image on the page with the display and text size settings, and you will see, or it's one of the things that's available on that screen is the option to choose larger text or bolder text, which are obviously features that would benefit someone with lower vision or vision needs. Small text is quite difficult to read for most people. So I spend a lot of time on Zoom, and a lot of the time I have to ask people to sort of zoom in so that I can see what they're displaying. Try to use 16 pixel body copy for your large screens at least, and try to avoid anything smaller than, I'm lost with the chat. Just give me a moment. Let me figure out how to close this. Oh boy, this is technology killing me here. I can't get to, I can't escape this. Okay, done. And I'm sorry if I've changed something about the questions, but I will avoid that going forward. Okay, right, sorry. So small text. So the default text settings for any browsers these days is 16 pixels. So you have to do a bit of work to change it. And I strongly advise that you don't. When I'm designing for apps, I will sometimes use 14 pixels for my mobile, but that's the lowest I will go for any content that's important. For things like credits or captions, sort of terms and conditions that perhaps people are not going to be diving into, I might go down to 13 or 12 pixels, but usually caps if possible. Some designers will justify text because it kind of looks nice when things are sort of aligned both sides. But this makes it quite difficult sometimes to figure out where one word ends and where the next starts, because you have your content is justified to fit a particular space. And sometimes the spacing between words, between letters is changed. And that doesn't create a good experience for some users. Uppercase text is a no-no for some screen readers. So I know that some people use uppercase text for emphasis. Some screen readers will read those bits of text letter by letter, which is not a great experience for your users. Moving on to contrast. So I see some questions. I promise I will answer them later, but juggling between Zoom and my presentation right now is not ideal. Contrast. So contrast ratios are a number between 1 and 21. If we had black text on a black background, your contrast ratio is 1. If we have black text on a white background, your contrast ratio is 21. So what you want to do is make sure that you're meeting accessibility standards with your contrast ratio. Things with low contrast are really hard to read. For normal text, what you're aiming for is 4.5 to 1 on your ratio. And for bold text, anything from 18.5 pixel bold, you can have 3 to 1. And for larger text, so anything that's 24 pixels and over, you can also have 3 to 1. How do I check my contrast? When I'm working in design tools like Figma, Sketch, or XD, there's a plugin called Spark, which is excellent. It helps you also do things like have a sense of what looking at your document when there are different types of color blindness involved might look like. Google also has a color contrast checker. So it's a Chrome extension that you can add. And then you can go to sites like the WebAIM, WCAG, Coolers to get access to their contrast checkers. Forms. I've designed quite a few forms. And if you did a quick search of the internet, you'd see that there's lots of advice on how to design forms. From an accessibility perspective, here are a few things that you need to do. So the first thing is try to ensure that any labels or hints that helps the person fill out the form need to be visible, separate from the form fields. So some people will be tempted to use placeholders as their labels. The second someone types into the input field, that will disappear, and that's not very helpful, and it's definitely not accessible. For things like icons that are used, so imagine that we have a popover or a pop-up. We might have a little icon in the top right. That close icon you would use an ARIA label for, and your ARIA label would say something like close button, to let someone using assistive technology know what is available, what actions that they can take with that modal. Focus states are really important. So people might be, a screen reader works different from a mouse, different from an eye. So your focus state kind of sort of symbolizes where the focus is. In the image on my screen, we have a focus state that's a dark blue, which contrasts with the white background of the form. So it is possible to know just by the focus state where I was currently within the form. Getting through the form is important. So if you're using anything other than a mouse, focus states are also important for helping with the navigation through the form. So if we think about radio buttons, getting to that label, you might have a focus state, then you might need to click enter to get to the sub states, so yes or no, or you can carry on to get to the next item. So thinking about these things, super important when you're doing form design. Finally, any feedback that you're giving your user has to be communicated with something other than just color. So typically people will design form errors and they'll have a nice little bold red outline. They'll have the copy in red, but what if you can't see the color red? You have to support this feedback using an icon. So typically I'll have a tick to signify that something has happened successfully, or I'll have a warning or a cross to say that something has gone wrong. Images are super important. We have a world now where there's entire sort of ecosystems around images. So think about sort of going through Instagram or Twitter. There are a lot of images that are in use. One of the first things that you need to do if you're planning to use imagery is to think about what's important. What images would, if you lost the images or if you removed the images, would you lose the context of the story that you're telling or the experience that you've created? If you don't, then that's decorative images. And I've had a few imagery or images that we've gone through on my presentation, and they're largely decorative because none of those images is essential to understand the content of my slides. Once you've determined which images are important, then you need to ensure that you create alt text that explains what the image is. What you're trying to do is provide the same sort of experience in words that the picture gives to someone that can see the picture. Any unimportant or decorative images, you would use an alt text of null, which is sort of like the empty string that I have on the screen. That's to make it clear that that isn't an important image in that experience. When we're writing alt text, there's a temptation to sort of just use the title of the page or some sort of short, non-descriptive text. That doesn't give the same vibe as the picture that you're creating. I often recommend that people create some sort of audio so that you hear how the picture is described, right? And it creates a nice experience for people that are going to be using sort of screen readers like VoiceOver to hear the experience of the text. So try to plan your alt text at the same time as you're writing the rest or sort of choosing the images that you use within your content. I have a picture of a tweet that I posted on Twitter. Basically, I went on a walk and I came across sort of a bookshop where there were like these brilliant packaged up books. And all you had to do was look at the bullet points on those books to decide whether you wanted to buy the book. So basically, don't judge a book by its cover. And the alt text that I wrote reads, picture of Chimmy's left hand holding 2 books, each wrapped in brown paper with string and a tag. The tag says blind date with a book and a wee blackbird. The book on the left is described with the bullets Gothic Romance, Witch, 1821, Family and Mysterious. And book 2 is described with Odd Family, Yorkshire, Newly Divorced, Romantic Comedy, Cute and Charming. So you get the same sense from my alt text as you do looking at the picture. I hope that makes sense. Moving on, color. Color is super important. Most designers are obsessed with using color to enhance the design. But one thing is clear, color should never be the only way that you can distinguish information on the page. Now, something that I do with my Mac is I will typically turn on accessibility mode and strip my Mac of any color in order to see what the experience of whatever I'm creating is like if I don't have color. So things that have that change state should have focus outlines, supporting icons, labels that let people know what's happening. Anything like a graph needs to have patterns that distinguish the different elements within the graph by something other than color. I have a picture on my screen from Trello, and the picture shows some cards on a project that I was working on, and each card has a different label. Now, from a color perspective, the labels are different colors. I have red labels and I have a purple label, but each of those also has a pattern. So if we took away the color, you would see that one label has 3 dots and another label has 3 wavy lines. It's easy to distinguish between those labels, even if I didn't have any color on my screen. So any designers that are working, you need to make sure that your design makes sense, even if it were only in a variety of grays. Now, language is probably something that most people didn't think that they would see in a talk around the needs of people with sort of vision disabilities or impairments. But something to point out here is that the way that your brain works when you're reading with your eyes is a little bit different from how screen readers or other assistive technology works. So a neurotypical brain can see a word correctly, no matter how it's spelled, as long as the first and the last letters are correct. If you aren't processing the information in that way, then it becomes difficult if you see abbreviations like Jan. So a screen reader will not read January out for you, but typically your brain, if you saw Jan, is reading January. Same thing with acronyms. So if you must use acronyms, you have to make sure that you spell it out at least once before using the acronym. So the example I have here is the National Health Service before I follow that with NHS. So that sets the scene for anyone who then subsequently sees NHS, they probably read the National Health Service. Finally, hashtags. Hashtags are very popular, especially on like Instagram or Twitter. And there's a temptation to write all in lowercase, but this makes it a little bit difficult to make out what the words are. So for virtually conference, I would use camel case, capitalizing the V and the C in the words, because that makes it very clear that there are 2 words in my hashtag. Next, hearing. Hearing is not as popular, I suppose, as it's not come along as much as vision, but there are a couple of things that we need to consider when we're thinking about creating content around that. So first we'll talk about visual notifications and potentially using sign language, and then we'll talk about subtitles, captions, and transcripts. First, visual notifications and sign languages. Sometimes we use sound for feedback within digital products. So if you've heard like a ka-ching or a womp womp that signify that something's gone right or something's gone wrong, then you need to make sure that you have a visual equivalent. And what I mean by a visual equivalent is something that gives, again, a similar emotion as the sound that you've used. So if you have a sound that's supposed to elicit joy, then you have to have a visual that does a similar thing. And if you have a sound that elicits sort of like sadness or reinforces sort of loss, like a womp womp, then you have to have text that has, sort of a visual notification that has a similar vibe as the sound that you used. Sign language, or the option of sign language, might require a little bit more planning and resources than some of the other options that we'll look at, but it's super inclusive and brings a lot of joy and delight. To have sign language, probably for something that's pre-recorded, you could create it and record it. And for something that's a bit live, you would have to get someone that speaks sign language to do that. So using that as an alternative or an option is really good. Next, subtitles, captions, transcripts are quite popular for some people on the internet. Subtitles, closed captions were created obviously for deaf people, but they're super useful for different kinds of people as well. If you're creating videos or other audiovisual content, you have to make sure that you're including subtitles. So when you're planning out the video, make sure that you're planning out what subtitles and or closed captions that you're going to include with that media. At Condé Nast, one of the key insights that I got sort of on a piece of research with Japan that was really interesting was that culturally there's a bit more sort of propriety, I guess, in the workplace. So we noticed a spike in the watching of our video content when we introduced subtitles, because it meant that people could sit at their desk and still watch those videos without turning any sound on within those sort of stricter work environments. This will also be true if you want access to your videos and other sort of audiovisual content on social media. Having subtitles and captions is important. Some of the tools that are available for free: amara.org.sub.com, Subtitle Horse. And if you're putting a video onto Facebook or YouTube, you can use their auto caption service. For transcripts and sort of a paid experience, then you can use rev.com. Transcripts are super helpful where you're doing audio for something that's been pre-recorded, like a podcast. I would argue that if you have the time to create content for a podcast, then you have the time to create the transcripts for those as well. Next, movement. So I use the word movement here to talk about needs around sort of using your body to interact with an interface. So things to consider around here would be your tap or touch area, being able to navigate through content without a mouse, and what to do as you create design that responds, so that is available on multiple device sizes. Let's start with tap or touch area. First, you want to have a lot of white space. I have a picture of Instagram, just an Instagram post, and I've highlighted the more link that's to the bottom right of the post. Several times a day, at least once a day, I end up clicking the people who like the message instead of getting a bit more information on the caption, which is what I'm aiming for. And that's because for some bizarre reason, the tap area for these functions within Instagram is so tiny. It drives me nuts. And if I had any other alternatives to Instagram, I would stop using the app purely for this reason. Now, I don't have gigantic hands. I have like sort of fairly standard finger sizes, but you need the dexterity of an archer or something to touch these things conveniently, which is very annoying for me and must be incredibly annoying for people with more needs than I have, access needs than I have. So please try to avoid such things, lots of white space to make sure that each element that you want people to touch has sufficient room for you to touch them. A mobile device tap area must be at least 44 pixels by 44 pixels. So we want a line height that's much higher than what we see in my example, or we want to use white space to generate that. Use a larger hotspot even when the element is smaller. So sometimes I have a 24 pixel icon, but I make sure that I communicate to the engineers and developers that the hotspot must be larger so that someone can tap without sort of having to zoom into the particular tiny link that I want them to. Any pop-ups, popovers must be dispensable, and the close function must be easy to tap as well. A few years ago, I had a couple of weeks where I had like terrible numbness in my right hand. So I think I had like carpal tunnel syndrome or RSI, and I really struggled to use my mouse. It was really difficult to navigate the web at that point because lots of sites make it absolutely impossible for you to go through without a mouse. How do we make sure that people that have to navigate, so whether you're using a keyboard or you're using assistive technology like a screen reader, you will have the same sort of experience. What we need to do is make sure that the content hierarchy makes sense. You can test your page structures yourself before you release them quite easily. I highly recommend to everyone in this room that after this talk, you can just like try to do things without your mouse just to see how terrible that experience is. So content hierarchy is what we talked about a little bit earlier, where we have to make sure that we have a structure. So using a headings to make it clear how you navigate through the site. When we have elements on the page that aren't sort of headings, anything that will be focusable, you need to make sure that you test how you go through. So if we use a make-believe scenario, if I have one H1, which is my page title, for example, and then I have 3 headings, which are H2s, then a bit of content, some H3s. What you're doing is planning, if someone hits the tab, they will tab first to the H1, then they'll tab immediately to the H2s. If they hit enter, then they can go into the content within the H2s. If there's an H3 there, they go straight to it. They can go to links within that. You need to plot. It's like drawing a map through your content, and you need to annotate your design to let the developers know how to create that content hierarchy for people. You have to make sure that there are no dead ends, especially when you have embedded media on the page. So typically you will go onto a site, you'll tab into a video, and it's impossible to come out of that video or to come out of that image. So you need to make sure that anything that can be tabbed into, that you're able to tab back out of. If the navigation is not clear, so you can't just look at it and go, yeah, I go from this to this to this to this, then make sure that you annotate those designs clearly with what the route is. And focus states, like I said, are super important, as well as active states, because if you're using a mouse, there's no way to sort of know, there's no cursor to see, right? Because lots of people rely on the cursor to indicate like a hover or a focus. But what you want to do is make sure that you use those outlines, and you need to make sure that those outlines have a high enough contrast ratio that they stand out to the user. Next, adaptive design is different from responsive design because the content actually adapts or changes significantly as you go from one screen to the next. So I have an image on the screen that shows a desktop, a tablet, and a mobile. On the desktop, we have 4 bits of content with a full width heading, 2 side-by-side bits of text, and another full bit of a full width bit of content. When we go to mobile, that changes to just the heading and the side-by-sides, but the side-by-sides are no longer horizontal, they're now vertical. And on the mobile, we have 3 equally sized bits of content, both in height and in width. That's adaptive because it hasn't just kept the same shape or positioning as it's gone from one screen to the next. The other thing that you want to do is probably avoid horizontal scrolling. Now, on a mobile phone, vertical scrolling is very easy. Like, I've given a 1.5-year-old my phone and she figured out how to scroll because it's natural. Horizontal scrolling on small screens is not as natural. So I try to avoid them, death to the carousel. But if I must have it, then I ensure that people can get through that content by tapping and not just only swiping, because that's just easier to get through. An example of adaptive design from something I just launched last week. I have 2 pictures. On the desktop, there's a progress bar. The progress bar is represented in a visual way with 4 steps and a bar. Each step is highlighted by a little circle. The page also has a form. The form has 2 titles, so a heading, a page title, and a form title. And then there's a summary on the right-hand side. When we take this down to mobile, then the progress bar completely disappears because there's not enough room for the progress bar. So it just becomes a single line of text that says step 1 of 4. And the summary that is on the right side actually collapses into a small sticky object at the bottom of the screen. So this is because I'd thought about how the content should adapt as it goes from one side screen to the other to prevent any sort of side scrolling. So it's all vertical and it all makes sense for that particular size. Finally, cognition. So cognition has to do with your brain and how you process information. I wonder if any of you have ever tried reading when you're hungry, cold, tired, or stressed. In any of those conditions, I find myself going over very simple sentences over and over and over again. Neurodiversity means that not every brain works the same, and you need to cater for people with different needs. People with dyslexia, ADHD, learning disabilities, and anything that is atypical within the cognition space. What are we going to consider here? Images, simplicity, treating our text in particular ways, and readability. While images might not be so good for low vision or blind people, they're actually great for people that have ADHD or dyslexia. So when you have huge bits of text or huge blocks of content, that really puts off people that are dyslexic or have ADHD. So what you want to do is try to use some imagery to break up that content and to make it possible to understand what's going on without necessarily reading the text. Things to note if you're breaking up the content in this way, of course, is that we need to make sure that we have alt text for every image that's used so that we don't create a problem for other kinds of users. We need to use the right file types. So if you have lots of images on a page, then you're adding sort of size, heft, if you like, to the website. So you need to make sure that you optimize the image sizes and use the right kind of files. So don't use SVGs everywhere. You have to try to use raster images where it makes sense, JPEGs where it makes sense, and so on and so forth. Don't alternate your images and text. So make sure that you don't go image, then text, then image, because it creates a problem with how you read, and it creates a problem with assistive devices sort of going through the page as well. I have an example from Monzo's page of a bit of text around banking made easy, and then they show you a screenshot of their app and how simple it is to use, and then banking that makes a statement. And again, it's supported by a picture of one of their cards, and well, one of their cards, the steel card, which is the thing that makes the statement. Simplicity. Lots of people try to put as much stuff onto a page as possible. If you go to design school, one of the things that you'll be shown is Ling Ling's Cars, which is a highly effective website, but it's a nightmare for anyone with any kind of perception, sensitivity, or ADHD, because there are things moving everywhere. You want to try to have a clean design, use lots of white space. Important things stand out when you have white space around them. Anything, if you're going to have things that move, you must absolutely ensure that your user controls it. So you don't want things that just sort of like start moving without the user being aware of how to stop it. Same goes for autoplay video and sound. It's incredibly jarring when something autoplays, especially when someone is not expecting it. Finally, try to be consistent in the use of iconography, colors, patterns. If you use a button in one way, that button should be consistent in the way that you use it. So if you have like primary CTA, this primary CTA shouldn't change colors throughout the journey. If you use any patterns, then things must mean the same thing. So try not to use like one icon that means one thing in one context and another thing in a different context. This creates a lot of cognitive load for people. Text. So we've talked about this a little bit. I know lots of people love a serif. I'm not a fan. I'm a fan of sans serif typefaces in digital design because it reads elegantly and is more clear. You don't have sort of like trailing bits hanging about. While black on white text is highly contrasting, it's actually a little bit of a struggle for people that have dyslexia. So the best colors for such people with such needs would be sort of a pale yellow or pale pink background for your white text, because that's gentler on the eye. Comic Sans is also an excellent font for people with dyslexia. Avoid capitalization or italics. If you're trying to emphasize things, try to stick with bold text instead. Finally, readability. So lots of people here probably aren't writers. I'm not a writer, but I tend to write a lot of UX copy. One of the things that you have to pay attention to, whether you're a designer or a writer, is that you can't have content that stretches the full width of the screen. So we have some gigantic monitors. Do not stretch your content. You want to limit content width to around 1200 pixels max. And I'm talking about content that you want people to read. You want approximately 75 to 80 characters per line, as this is quite comfortable for people to read. Next, you need to write for a 9-year-old. I alluded to how difficult it is to understand what's going on if you're hungry, tired, stressed. When you write for a 9-year-old, you're going to be ensuring that people with different cognitive needs are able to read. I use the Hemingway app. It's an online tool to check my writing. It lets you know when your writing is getting overcomplicated. There are other tools, but I couldn't remember any particular link to put into this presentation. So have a Google around readability to find other options. You have to choose simple over clever every time. No jargon, no sort of multi-syllabic, sort of 4 or 5 syllable words. Try to use more verbs and less adverbs in your writing. And for ease of cognition, try to use bullets where you can. Group words, 3 to 5 words frequently, because that's the number of words that people are able to read and understand easily. I hope that you have been able to get a few tips out of this talk. That means you'll leave here today and immediately start improving the accessibility of your products. Try not to be discouraged by sort of aiming for perfect immediately. If every single one of us here went away and got our products even 20, 30, 40% more accessible, we'd be doing a much better job than what's happening today. So 97% of websites are currently inaccessible, and that is not good. The best way to get accessible, of course, is to actually work with disabled people. You want to have people that actually understand the access needs. I've given sort of little tips of how I try to bring a little bit of empathy into my world, but empathy does not replace centering disability. So don't just try to meet the standards, try to work with people who need the most access. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chimmy. So many useful tips in there. And yeah, thanks everyone for asking your questions. I've got a few here for you, Chimmy. The first of which from Emma. Emma asks, how do you feel about using an icon together with text as an alternative to an underline?
An icon together with text. So if you can put the icon together with text within the body of text, that's fine. So I think I was like, my link situation is when you have paragraphs of content and you need one of those things to go somewhere. So a navigation function, you can't suddenly insert an icon within that. And to ensure that you're not just relying on color, that's why you have to have the underline. So I can support icons with text where you're designing what is sometimes referred to as a tertiary or ghost button, but not for links.
Awesome, thank you. And a question from Patrick. How to best handle call to action buttons? Sorry, let me rephrase this. Sorry, how would you best handle call to action buttons considering the navigation links?
So call to action buttons. So buttons are actually a particular thing within code. So if something is going to be a button, you need to make sure that it's treated like a button. So don't try to treat buttons as links or vice versa. Once you declare something to be a button and you have array labels, then it will be accessible. But when you try to sort of replace or interchange buttons and links, that doesn't really work.
Awesome, thank you. So next question is from Freya. Freya asks, what are your thoughts on using native operating system fonts versus a universal bundled font? Thinking in terms of clarity on higher density displays.
I am a huge fan of using native operating system fonts because they're already designed to work very effectively on the operating system that they were designed for. Typically, obviously, you'll come up against brand. So what I do is I will take a brand typeface for my headings, because there you can stand out quite nicely. But for body copy and general sort of text, I will try generally to use the native operating system font.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have a question here from Bob, who asks, about 15 years ago, I was advised the most readable combination was black on yellow. Where does this sit in accessibility?
100%. Black on yellow is really good. You'll have a problem using black on yellow with, what's it called? All of the brands. So I wouldn't sort of be like, yep, definitely go black and yellow. But if you can go black and yellow, yes. If you can provide alternatives so someone can change their background to black and yellow, that would be great. And also, if you create a dark theme, then a dark theme is generally more comfortable than stark black and white.
Thank you very much. We've got another question here from Emma, who asks if you could give an example of a notification sound in visual.
So notification sound, this is going to go probably wrong, but you kind of have like bing to indicate that something has happened, a notification has arrived. Obviously, my support visual experience would be the use of a red notification alert, you know, like the red things that hang out next to your email or whatever. That would be the visual equivalent of a sound.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we've just got a couple more here. We have a question asking about where the 97% of websites are inaccessible stat had come from.
I should have put that there. So it was Google. I saw a quote from Google from either 2019 or 2020, which is shocking. So I had a previous stat that was from the, I can't remember who they were, but it was more like 70% of websites are inaccessible. And that was like 2 years ago. So to see the 97% stat from this year was shocking. I will try to find it and circulate it to you all, but I saw it and I forgot to copy the reference.
Awesome. No, that is jaw-dropping, that 97% of websites are inaccessible. So final question from Sandra. Will the session be available afterwards, please? Yes, all the recordings will be online from Wednesday, pretty much as soon after the conference finishes at about 4 o'clock UK time. We'll send everyone that's signed up for any session all the links to those. And yeah, I'm sure we can maybe share your slides as well, Chimmy. Would that be okay?
Yes, of course. My slides are good to share.
Awesome, brilliant. Well, no, that is everything. Thanks so much, Chimmy. That was really, really useful. And thank you for presenting. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Our next session is back here at 4 o'clock UK at 3 o'clock UK time, sorry, with Alicia Jarvis from Scotiabank with her talk Inclusion by Design. So we'll see you then. We hope you enjoyed yourselves. And yeah, thanks again, Chimmy.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Cheers.